Hi everyone. I didn't quite finish the lecture today, and I also wasn't quite satisfied with my discussion of the prisoner's dilemma, so I wanted to go through that aspect of the lecture one more time and then continue on to the end. So I said that the game theoretic model of a prisoner's dilemma was useful for thinking about Hobbes's characterization of the state of nature. So the basic prisoner's dilemma story is two conspirators in a crime have been arrested and they've been put into separate cells to be interrogated. And the police officer doing the interrogation has told both of them that if they confess, they will go free, but they have to be the one who confesses first, because the person who confesses second will go to jail for a long period of time. Whereas if neither one confesses, they'll both do a shorter time in jail. So here's the idea. You have two prisoners, prisoner 1 and prisoner 2, and each one has two options. They can remain quiet or they can confess. If they both remain quiet, they're both going to get a 1-year sentence. If player 1 remains quiet while player 2 confesses, player 1 gets a 10-year sentence while player 2 goes free. On the other hand, if player 1 confesses first, he gets to go free, and player 2 then gets the 10-year sentence. But if they both confess, they both will share the 10-year sentence and get 5 years each in prison. Now here's the reason this is a dilemma. As a group, they would be better off if they both remained quiet. They would each get a year in prison, and that's 2 years total. But as individuals, both of them would fare better, no matter what the other one does, if they opted to confess. All right, so let's say that you're player 1, or you're prisoner 1, and prisoner 2 decides to keep quiet. Well, in that case, it's better for you to confess, right? If prisoner 2 keeps quiet and you confess, you get to go free. So now let's say that person 2 or prisoner 2 decides to confess. Well, then you're also better off if you confess, because if he confesses and you confess, you get 5 years. But if he confesses and you remain quiet, then you get 10 years. So the idea is that no matter what the other person does at the individual level, where people are trying to maximize their own payoffs, each individual is always better off no matter what the other person does in confessing. So each person is better off confessing regardless of what the other player does. Okay? And so the idea is that a similar scenario is playing out in the state of nature. Let's say you have two people who encounter each other in a state of nature. They have a choice between peace and violence. Each one of them has that choice. Now, if they're both peaceful, they might get a modest payoff. But if person 1 chooses peace while person 2 chooses violence, person 1 will end up much worse for the wear, and vice versa. If person 1 chooses violence while person 2 chooses peace, person 2 will suffer a terrible defeat, and they both suffer some losses in the case that they both engage in violent action. But the point here is that this, again, is the same dilemma. The dilemma is that the group is better off as a whole if the group is peaceful, right? Everybody gets a nice, comfortable 5. But when individuals evaluate this decision as individuals who are concerned with maximizing their own payoffs, then it's rational individually, no matter what the other person does, to choose violence. So again, let's look at person 1. If person 1 is playing against person 2, and person 2 chooses peace, then person 1 is better off choosing violence, because in the case that he chooses violence and person 2 chooses peace, he gets a victory of 10, right, which is better than 5. And if person 2 plays violence, again, person 1 is better off playing violence because he suffers a loss of -50 rather than suffering a loss of -100. And the same thing is the case for person 2. So that's the idea. The idea is that it's a dilemma because at the group level, the group will be better off if it's peaceful. But at the individual level, it's always rational to choose violence, right? So in the face of this scenario, the rational choice is to choose violence. Okay, and so Hobbes says there's 2 ways to solve this problem. One is through reputation. You can create a kind of deterrence effect by being violent to the point that people will want to stay away from you because you have a reputation for being particularly cruel in your retaliation. But Hobbes says an even better solution is what he calls the Leviathan, right? This is a government that can essentially penalize people for violence. So if you add a penalty to the equation, when person 1 is peaceful and person 2 is violent, the penalty makes it such that violence no longer pays. So now when player 1 plays peace, player 2 no longer has an incentive to be violent, because peace in the face of peace pays off more than violence in the face of peace does, because the government is inflicting a 15-point penalty. And the same thing is true here, right? So if player 2 chooses peace, player 1 no longer has an incentive to play violence because the penalty will make being violent less profitable. And of course, violence is yet more disincentivized here, where both players are penalized. So this is Hobbes' notion of how you solve the problem of violence. The problem of violence is not that we're intrinsically bad, it's that violence is incentivized in a state of nature because you're thinking at the level of individual rationality instead of thinking at the level of group rationality. And there's no external coercive force to prevent you from thinking that way. Right, so you get into this kind of dilemma where you know everyone is a free agent and an individual actor that is self-interested, and so you have to act accordingly, because you know if you won't, other people will. Okay, so this is where Hobbes comes up with the idea of a social contract. He says, in a state of nature, right, one of the normative assumptions is what he calls the right of nature. By all means, we can to defend ourselves. So you can use any means necessary to defend yourself. You're entitled to that in a state of nature because other self-interested individuals will do the same. And he says what follows from this is the first law of nature. And the law of nature is not like unlike a right of nature, is something that reason should tell them to do, right? It's an ought. It's a principle of rationality that you derive through an analysis of the state of nature. And he says this first law of nature is to seek peace and follow it as much as possible. So the state of nature is so uncertain, the scenario where violence is always the rational choice. And so if there is any opportunity for peace to escape these types of violent outcomes, then you should take it. And from that he derives what he calls the second law of nature, that a man be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, it's necessary to lay down this right to all things. So in other words, the second law of nature, derived from the first law of nature, is that insofar as other men are willing, we all ought to lay down our entitlement to the right of nature, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So these are the two laws of nature that he says any rational person should come to after looking at the state of nature and understanding how nasty, brutish, and short it is. You look at the state of nature, take that as a baseline, and you realize no one should have to live that way. It's a condition of violence. It's a condition without culture. It's a condition without education. It's a terrible way to live. And so rational analysis of that scenario tells you that you should seek peace and follow it whenever possible, and you should be willing to lay down the right of nature insofar as other people are willing to do the same. And that's what he calls the social contract. He says this is the basis and foundation of government. The mutual transferring of right is that which men call social contract. So the idea is, it's not that this in fact happened. It's not like at some point everyone said, all right, I'm going to lay down my entitlement to cause harm to other people. It's rather a rational analysis of the legitimacy of government. Government is justified under the idea that free, rational people would willingly consent to lay down their right to live in a state of nature in light of their preference for a government that has a monopoly on the use of force that can protect them from the kind of violent social dilemmas characteristic of a state of nature. And it's for this reason that Hobbes fits nicely, even though he is a royalist and he is a conservative and a counter-revolutionary in his own way, he is still pushing the ball forward towards Enlightenment ideals in the sense that he's claiming that the source of justification or the legitimation of a ruler is not divine authority, is not the divine right given to kings by priests in the church. It is rather the consent of the individuals who make up the state that is governed by the ruler. So the ruler has an absolute monopoly on the use of force, but his use of force is legitimate only because the individuals who make up the state legitimize it by freely consenting to lay down their right in order to take part in the government. So that's what's represented here in this famous image from the cover page of Hobbes' major work, the Leviathan. Here you have the sovereign who has an absolute monopoly on the use of force, and you see that he's comprised of the tiny individuals who make up the state, because those individuals, through an act of free consent, mutually contract with each other to legitimize the authority of the sovereign. So this points back to Tom Freeman's lecture. If you'll recall, Tom Freeman said that during the time of the Revolution, people who were anti-royalists were saying, look, the king isn't a divine authority. He doesn't get his authority from God. He gets his authority from some kind of original contract with the people. And here Hobbes is giving a very explicit account and justification of precisely how that sort of contract is made. That contract is made when people who recognize that living without government is intolerable come together and mutually lay down their right, their entitlement to the right of nature, to take any means necessary to defend themselves, and to enter into a mutual social contract that recognizes a legitimate sovereign with a monopoly on the use of force. So this means Hobbes gets his own little torch there. You can see him. He's the middle figure on the left column.